Butch Cassidy and his Wild Bunch, a gang that included the Sundance Kid, stopped a Union Pacific train in its tracks just outside of Wilcox, Wyoming, when they set dynamite into the trestle of a small wooden railroad bridge. The age of train robbery had arrived. But before we dive into what the Wild West train robberies were really like and the plans behind it, make sure to subscribe to the Harsh West. We have some crazy videos coming. And with it came some of the most audacious criminal minds the frontier had ever seen. But here's what most people don't realize. These weren't random acts of desperation. Every successful train robbery was a masterpiece of planning, timing, and calculated risk that would make modern heist movies look amateur by comparison. Think about it for a second. How do you stop a massive iron beast traveling at full speed through the middle of nowhere? How do you crack open safes designed to be impregnable? And perhaps most importantly, how do you escape when every lawman in 3 states is hunting you down? The answers to these questions reveal a hidden world of criminal genius that shaped the American West in ways we're only beginning to understand. The story begins not with outlaws, but with opportunity. After the war, many soldiers were faced with little economic opportunity upon returning home, and train robbing required little specialized skill. The Civil War had ended, leaving thousands of battle-hardened veterans, particularly Confederate guerrillas, without purpose or prospects. Men who had learned to strike fast, hit hard, and disappear into the countryside suddenly found themselves in a world where those very skills could make them rich. Initially, trains were perceived to be largely impenetrable, especially when compared with the earlier stagecoach, and were often unguarded or only lightly guarded. Railroad companies, drunk on their own success and technological superiority, made a fatal miscalculation. They assumed their moving fortresses of iron and steam were robbery-proof. They were wrong. The first peacetime train robbery in the United States occurred on October 6, 1866, when robbers boarded an Ohio and Mississippi train shortly after it left Seymour, Indiana. The Reno Gang had just written the playbook that would terrorize railroad companies for the next 4 decades. But it was a former Confederate guerrilla named Jesse James who would turn train robbery from crime into legend. Jesse James didn't just rob trains, he revolutionized the entire criminal enterprise. Earlier in July, the gang had learned that $75,000 in gold from the Cheyenne region was to come through a dare on the recently built main line of the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad. Jesse sent his brother, Frank James, and Cole Younger to Omaha to learn when the gold shipment was to reach Adair. Finally, Frank James and Cole Younger got their tip that the gold shipment was on its way east, and they brought the report to Jesse, who had made plans for the train robbery. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment decision by desperate men. This was intelligence gathering worthy of a military operation. And yes, there's a twist coming you probably didn't expect about how they actually stopped that train. What made outlaws like Jesse James and Butch Cassidy so successful wasn't their shooting skills, it was their obsessive attention to planning. Every major train robbery followed a similar pattern of preparation that could take weeks or even months. First came the intelligence phase. James and his gang painstakingly reviewed train schedules before choosing to rob the Rock Island line just outside of Adair, Iowa. Saloon, but schedules were just the beginning. The truly successful gangs had inside information, corrupt railroad employees, telegraph operators who could be bribed, or express company guards willing to share when the big shipments were moving. Have you ever wondered how outlaws in the 1870s, without phones or radios, coordinated complex operations across hundreds of miles? The answer reveals just how sophisticated these criminal networks really were. Gang members would spread out across multiple towns, gathering intelligence like a web of spies. They'd meet at predetermined locations, remote ranches, hidden valleys, or brothels where no questions were asked, to share what they'd learned. The James Gang's robbery at Gad's Hill showed another level of sophistication. On January 31, 1874, 5 men, believed to have been Jesse and Frank James, Cole Younger, Jim Younger, and John Younger, entered the small town of Gad's Hill, Missouri, and robbed the general store. Afterwards, they proceeded to hold the townspeople hostage inside the store. A train was expected to arrive there at 4 p.m. that day, but it ended up being 45 minutes late. When it did arrive, the James Younger gang created a bonfire on the train tracks and waved a red flag in front of it to make the train conductor stop immediately. This wasn't just about stopping a train. It was about controlling an entire town, turning every citizen into an unwilling accomplice to ensure no one could warn the approaching locomotive. But that's not even the craziest part of their planning methodology. The most dramatic and dangerous method of stopping a train involved sabotaging the tracks themselves. A classic tactic was to sabotage the tracks ahead of the train, either by removing rails or placing obstructions on the line, according to True West. This forced the train to stop in a pre-selected, isolated spot where the robbers lay in wait. But here's where it gets truly ingenious. In preparation, they loosened part of the track and then tied a rope to it. As the train approached, James and the gang pulled the rope, forcing the tracks to move and the train to derail. Picture that for a moment. Outlaws hiding in the darkness, rope in hand, waiting for the exact moment to literally pull the ground out from under a speeding train. The physics had to be perfect. Pull too early, and the engineer might spot the damage and stop in time. Pull too late, and the train might pass over before the rail moves. The margin for error was measured in seconds, and the consequences of failure meant either capture. The rope was passed under the south rail and led to a hole they had cut in the bank in which to hide. When the train came along, the rail was jerked out of place and the engine plunged into the ditch and toppled over on its side. Engineer John Rafferty of Des Moines was killed, the fireman Dennis Foley died of his injuries, and several passengers were injured. This wasn't the romantic image Hollywood would later sell us. This was brutal, dangerous, and often deadly. The James Gang's first train robbery killed innocent men, a fact that tends to get lost in the mythology. But for the Outlaws, this was just the beginning of their problems, of any train robbery. Now came the real challenge, getting into the express car where the real treasure waited. Before the invention of dynamite, it was almost impossible to break into safes. Criminals required the combination lock to open safes and often relied on the courier to provide it. Following its invention and widespread use, it became much easier to break into safes and rob trains. Alfred Nobel's invention of dynamite in 1867 changed everything. Suddenly, outlaws had a weapon that could crack open any safe if they knew how to use it, and that if killed more robbery attempts than all the lawmen in the West combined. If a safe couldn't be opened by force or persuasion, outlaws resorted to dynamite, as highlighted by Cowboy State Daily. They would pack explosives around the safe's door and detonate it, hoping to blast it open without destroying the contents. This was a gamble. Too little dynamite, and the safe stayed shut. Too much, and the loot was shredded or burned. The noise also alerted nearby towns and lawmen who could be on the scene before the gang finished collecting their prize. The Wild Bunch learned this lesson the hard way. The Wild Bunch, consisting of the roughest elements of the Hole-in-the-Wall gang, primarily Harvey Logan, alias Kid Curry, Robert Leroy Parker, alias Butch Cassidy, and Harry Longbaugh, alias the Sundance Kid, forced the Union Pacific Overland Limited crew to uncouple the express car and remove it some distance from the passenger cars. Once this was done, the safe in this car was dynamited, and in the process, the entire express car was destroyed. The robbers then blew up the safe with dynamite, actually using too much of the explosive, and blew up the entire railroad carriage. They 5 bandits stole around $36,000. Imagine being an outlaw, having successfully stopped a train, fought your way to the express car, only to use too much dynamite and watch your fortune literally go up in smoke. Some gangs reportedly spent more on dynamite practicing their technique than they ever stole in actual robberies. But even when everything went perfectly, the train stopped, the safe cracked, the loot secured. The hardest part was still ahead. How do you disappear when every telegraph line in the country is buzzing with your description? To delay pursuit, robbers often cut telegraph wires along the route before striking. Entry of the Great Train Robbery. This prevented train crews or station agents from sending word to nearby towns, buying the gang precious time to escape. However, telegraph lines were hard to find and cut, especially at night or in bad weather. The getaway was where most train robberies fell apart. Outlaws would stash their best horses in the brush near the ambush site, ready to ride hard for the nearest hideout or border. But this plan had its flaws. The sound of gunfire and explosions often spooked the horses, or the animals wandered off while the gang was busy. Pursuing posses often had fresh mounts or used the railroad itself to overtake fleeing bandits, leading to many captures. The Wild Bunch had a different strategy, one that would revolutionize outlaw tactics. At 1 a.m. on June 20, 1899, Cassidy, Sundance Kid, Harvey Logan, and Lay robbed a Union Pacific train near Wilcox, Wyoming. The gang split up afterward, a common ploy to throw off pursuers, and several fled to New Mexico. This splitting technique was genius. Instead of one large group leaving an obvious trail, you had multiple smaller groups heading in different directions. Law enforcement had to choose which trail to follow, and they usually chose wrong. But we'll come back to that. But first, let's talk about the human network that made these escapes possible. Here's something that might surprise you. The most successful train robbers weren't lone wolves. They were part of vast networks of sympathizers, from poor farmers who hated the railroad companies to corrupt officials who tipped them off about incoming posses. The gang was also closely associated with female outlaws Ann Bassett and Josie Bassett, whose ranch near Browns Park supplied the gang often with fresh horses and beef. Both Bassett girls became romantically involved with several members of the gang, and both occasionally accompanied the gang to one of their hideouts called Robber's Roost. Associations with ranchers like these in the area allowed the gang considerable mobility, giving them an easy resupply of fresh horses and supplies and a place to hole up for a night or two. The Wild Bunch had 3 major hideouts that became legendary in their own right. Their chief hideouts were Hole in the Wall, a nearly inaccessible grassy canyon and rocky retreat in north-central Wyoming; Brown's Hole, now Browns Park, a hidden valley of the Green River near the intersection of the borders of Wyoming, Colorado, and Utah; Robber's Roost, a region of nearly impenetrable rugged canyons in east-central Utah. These weren't just camping spots, they were fortresses. Hole in the Wall, for instance, could only be accessed through a narrow canyon that one man with a rifle could defend against an army. Outlaws would post sentries on the canyon walls who could spot approaching posses miles away. By the time law enforcement arrived, the gang would have vanished into a maze of canyons that only they knew how to navigate. But the railroad companies weren't going to take this lying down. They had money, technology, and something even more dangerous. They had the Pinkertons. This special outlaw hunting posse, perhaps one of the first SWAT teams, had a specially equipped baggage car designed to carry 8 members and their horses. The group was led by a former Lincoln County WYO sheriff who later became the chief special agent for the Illinois Central Railroad. Upon notification that a train robbery had occurred, the Rangers were promptly taken to the scene by train in their special car. Upon arrival, they relentlessly pursued the outlaws on horseback. Think about that innovation for a second. While outlaws were escaping on horseback, the railroad companies were loading fresh horses and trackers onto trains, racing them to the crime scene at speeds no horse could match. The very technology the outlaws were robbing was being turned into their worst enemy. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency became infamous for hunting down train robbers. According to Smithsonian Magazine, outlaws tried to outsmart these relentless pursuers by changing hideouts, using aliases, or splitting up after a job. Despite their efforts, the Pinkertons' vast network, use of informants, and dogged persistence led to the capture or death of most famous train robbers. The Pinkertons didn't just chase outlaws. They infiltrated their networks, turned their friends into informants, and used psychological warfare. They'd spread false information about where posses were headed, trying to drive outlaws into ambushes. They'd offer massive rewards that turned every friend into a potential Judas. Have you ever wondered what it felt like to be hunted by an organization with unlimited resources and no boundaries? The mental toll on these outlaws was crushing. Many turned to alcohol, became paranoid, or made fatal mistakes under the pressure. Subscribe to our channel to hear more about the dark psychological games played in the Old West, stories Hollywood never tells you. Now here's the truth that shatters the romantic myth. Most train robberies were disasters. For every successful heist that made headlines, dozens ended in death, capture, or pathetically small takes. Let's look at the cold, hard numbers that reveal why train robbery was actually a terrible career choice. In it, they found only $2,000 in currency. The gold shipment had been delayed. They collected only about $3,000, including the currency and loot taken from the passengers in the world's first robbery of a moving train. Jesse James's first train robbery, the one he'd planned for weeks, the one that was supposed to net $75,000 in gold, brought in just $3,000. Split among 7 men, that's less than $450 each for risking their lives and becoming wanted men. But that's not even the worst part. Their first attempted train robbery in 1891 netted them nothing but arrest warrants after they killed the train's brakemen. The Dalton gang's first attempt didn't just fail, it turned them into murderers for absolutely nothing. Even successful robberies came with hidden costs. Dynamite was expensive. Horses had to be fed and replaced. Bribes had to be paid. Safe houses required money to maintain. Gang members who were wounded needed medical care from doctors who wouldn't ask questions. And those doctors didn't come cheap. When you factor in all the expenses, many successful train robbers barely broke even. By the 1890s, the golden age of train robbery was already dying, killed not by lawmen but by innovation. Express companies started using time-lock safes that couldn't be opened until they reached their destination. No amount of dynamite or torture could change that. Early trains passed through vast, uninhabited areas with little to no communication infrastructure, making it difficult for law enforcement to respond quickly. But that was changing fast. Telegraph lines spread like spider webs across the frontier. Suddenly, a robbery in Wyoming could be known in Denver within minutes. Telephone lines followed, making communication even faster. The railroad companies started hiring armed guards. Not just one or two, but entire teams of experienced gunmen who rode in armored cars. But the real game changer, photography. By the 1900s, wanted posters didn't just have descriptions, they had actual photographs. In 1874, the Adams Express Company turned to the Pinkerton National Detective Agency to stop the James Younger gang. The Pinkertons built extensive photo databases of known outlaws and their associates. Suddenly, changing your name and moving to a new town wasn't enough. Your face followed you everywhere. As the 19th century ended, the smart outlaws saw the writing on the wall. In early 1901, Cassidy, the Sundance Kid, and Sundance's girlfriend Etta Place relocated to Argentine Patagonia, where they spent time at La Leona, 110 kilometers from El Calafate in the province of Santa Cruz, to escape the pursuit of Pinkerton detectives and other lawmen. But even escape wasn't truly escape. The long arm of American law enforcement reached into South America. The Pinkertons sent operatives to Argentina and Bolivia. The same patterns repeated: rob, run, hide, repeat, until there was nowhere left to run. Parker and Longabaugh are believed to have been killed in a shootout with the Bolivian army in November 1908. The exact circumstances of their fate are unclear. The ultimate fate of Butch and Sundance remains one of history's great mysteries. Did they die in Bolivia? Did Butch return to America and live quietly until the 1930s, as some claim? The uncertainty itself tells us something profound. Even in death, these outlaws managed one final vanishing act. What's truly remarkable is how the tactics developed by Wild West train robbers influenced crime for the next century. The idea of inside information, coordinated timing, explosive entry, and planned escape routes. This became the template for bank robberies, armored car heists, and even modern cybercrime. Consider this. When John Dillinger robbed banks in the 1930s, he used modified versions of Wild West techniques, inside information, careful planning, fast cars instead of horses. When the Great Train Robbery occurred in Britain in 1963, the robbers studied American Wild West techniques. The echo of Jesse James and Butch Cassidy reverberates through every heist movie you've ever watched. The Old West's infamous train robbers and their historic heists profiles 16 noted train robbers, or train robbing gangs, along with the details of each of their 47 holdups. The mechanics of each of their train robberies, planning, execution, and escape are dissected and discussed. But there's an irony here that should make us think. These outlaws, who represented chaos and lawlessness, actually forced America to become more organized, more connected, and more lawful. Every robbery led to better security. Every escape led to better communication. Every success led to innovations that made the next robbery harder. After the Civil War, train robberies began in earnest and lasted up until the 1930s. Train robberies resulted in considerable loss of life and property, disrupted public transportation, and hindered the movement of people and goods across the United States. Human injury and death rates were sometimes high because many trains were derailed as part of the robbery, or cars were sometimes dynamited. Successfully eliminating these offenses stabilized rail transportation and, in part, signaled the taming of the Wild West. When we strip away the mythology and look at the raw facts, train robbery in the Wild West was a phenomenon that lasted barely 40 years. From the first robbery in 1866 to the effective end of the practice by 1910, we're talking about a single generation, yet in that brief window, these outlaws fundamentally changed America. They forced the creation of federal law enforcement. They drove innovations in communication and security. They created a mythology that still shapes how the world sees America. Every Western movie, every heist film, every story of outlaws against the system, it all traces back to those desperate men waiting in the darkness for an approaching train. What would possess someone to take on the most powerful corporations in America? backed by private armies and unlimited resources for the chance at a few $1,000s? The answer reveals something fundamental about the American character. That mixture of desperation and ambition, violence and ingenuity, individual freedom and collective progress. In an era in which cold-blooded killers such as Jesse James and the Younger Brothers terrorized the American West, Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid, and their Wild Bunch gang took a smart and methodical approach to bank and train robbery. In the 1890s, their thrilling exploits, robbing banks and trains, and then seemingly vanishing into thin air, became front-page news and the basis of rumor and myth, captivating Americans from coast to coast. These men weren't heroes. They weren't even particularly successful criminals, when you do the math. But they were something perhaps more important. They were the last of their kind, fighting a losing battle against the future itself. Every train they robbed brought more telegraph lines. Every success brought better locks. Every escape brought more determined pursuers. In the end, the trains won. The iron horses kept running, the safes got stronger, and the law got longer arms. The outlaws, they ended up dead, imprisoned, or fleeing to foreign countries where they died in poverty and obscurity. The romance of their stories has outlived them all, but the harsh reality is that train robbery was a fool's game played by desperate men in desperate times. Subscribe to our channel to explore more untold stories from the American frontier, because the truth is always more fascinating than the legend. The Wild West wasn't won by outlaws or lawmen. It was won by technology, communication, and the relentless march of progress that no amount of dynamite could stop.